I'd like to think Jesus is a great person. It's to me, it's a silly story.
耶稣是神的儿子，他同时也是真神。
It's idolization, basically, the idea that there's a human being that can be viewed as a god.
I believe that the teachings of Jesus, they ring true to me. It makes sense to live that way.
Jesus, I believe, was a liberal. And I think looking at where we're going, I think he'd be happy to see that people are becoming more and more accepting.
I think I grow more curious about that every day, and how I can be a better person, maybe by following his teachings, and maybe it will be a fit for me, and maybe it won't. But I have a lifetime to figure that out.
Think for a moment about the great movie trilogies that we all enjoy whenever we get the chance to see them all. One of the ones that comes to my mind right away, one of my favorites, is Back to the Future. 1, 2, and 3. I thought that 1 was the best and 3 was kind of iffy, but still, I love watching all 3 of them. Some of you might be Lord of the Rings fans, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I have to say, is one of the most visually dynamic movie trilogies that I've ever seen. And then I think they came out with another Hobbit trilogy, so that was also pretty cool. Some people are a fan of the Bourne movies, and not the 2 later ones, but the first 3 that had kind of one story arc that went through all 3 of the movies with Jason Bourne. But by far, I believe, this is my personal opinion, that the best movie trilogy was The Godfather. The Godfather. I loved it. Now, an interesting thing about The Godfather, the first movie, The Godfather, came out in 1972. And then 2 years later, Godfather Part 2 came out in 1974. But it would be 16 years, not until 1990, that Godfather Part 3 would come out. And what happened was, because of the amount of time in between the release of Part 1 and 2, and then 16 years until Part 3 was released, there were a lot of people who watched The Godfather Part 3 without really having seen 1 and 2. Now, if you have watched the Godfather movies, if you've just watched Godfather 3, then you know that the Part 3 of The Godfather is basically the story around the death, spoiler alert, of the main character played by Al Pacino, Michael Corleone, who was the Godfather. But the thing is that if you only watch Part 3, if that's the only part that you ever saw, you would never understand how it was that Michael became the Godfather. And you won't see that Michael never really wanted to be a part of the family business. He never wanted to be the one who was ruling and controlling the family. In fact, he spent his whole life trying to get himself and his family out of the business. And it's really impossible to fully appreciate the storyline, to understand the histories and the personalities and the motivations of the characters, unless you've seen the entire story from the beginning to the end. Now, for a lot of people, the story of Jesus and their understanding of the story of Jesus is limited to the accounts of Jesus' life that were written primarily in the 4 books that we call the Gospels, the 4 books in the New Testament that talk about Jesus from his birth to his death to his resurrection and afterwards. So the question for us is, what if there's more to the story? What if just that part there isn't all that there is to this story? Well, today we're in episode 5 of our series, Explore God, where we've been partnering with over 200 churches all throughout the San Francisco Bay Area to really take a deep dive in and to explore 7 big questions, to talk about 7 big questions about God and about faith. And today, about Jesus. And the question that we want to address today is really a simple question. Is Jesus really God? Is Jesus really God? And to answer that question, or at least to get us closer to an answer to that question, we will have to understand who Jesus is. Because in order for us to come to any kind of conclusion about whether or not he was God, we really have to understand who Jesus is. And you see, every one of us, regardless of what you believe about Jesus, every one of us has experienced a time in our lives, and maybe that time is right now, where we didn't or we don't fully understand who Jesus is. In fact, for a lot of people, even a lot of people who call themselves followers of Jesus, don't fully understand who Jesus is. And I think, listen, if we're honest, I think most of us know that none of us are really sure, even now. One of the things that we've been saying all throughout this series is that our goal here is not to try to convince you of anything. It's not to try to make you believe in something, but our goal is simply for us to explore together these questions and explore them because, listen, they're complex questions. And the beauty and, of course, sometimes the difficulty of faith is that we can never really be sure. We can never be 100% sure. That's where the faith comes in. See, faith is having confidence in things that you can't see, things that can't be completely 100% without a single shred of doubt proved. So in our time together today, I want to go through what I think are the only 3 conclusions that you can come to when it comes to who Jesus is and answering the question, is Jesus really God? I think there's only three conclusions that you could come to. The first one is simply this, that Jesus never existed. And there are arguments for this idea that Jesus never existed. First of the one is that there's no people will say that there's no secular or outside of the scriptures, outside of the Bible, there's no secular evidence of Jesus' existence. Now, a lot of people will say the only reason we know that Jesus existed is because it was written in the Bible. And so that's kind of like a self-serving loop, right? But at that time in the early part of the after Jesus lived, I don't even know what to call it, of the last millennium. No, the first millennium. In the early part, like in the hundreds AD. I think that's what we call it. There was a Jewish historian. His name was Flavius Josephus. Josephus wrote a few books. One of the books that he wrote was called Jewish Antiquities. And so this is outside of the Bible. And listen to what Josephus wrote. He said, "There was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was Christ, or the Messiah, or the Anointed One. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." So here is one author who is not a Christian talking about the existence of Jesus. In the annals of Imperial Rome, which was a first century history of the Roman Empire, written by this gentleman, Roman senator and historian Tacitus, right around 116 AD, he was writing about the burning of Rome and the fact that Rome had burned and the Emperor Nero was blaming the Christians for it. And he mentions that Nero falsely blamed, listen to what he writes, the persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities, or for their generosity, for the things that they did. Christ, the Messiah, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius. So now we have a second reference to Jesus. Roman governor Pliny the Younger wrote to the Emperor Trajan that the early Christians would sing hymns to Christ as to a god. Some scholars also believe that Roman historian Suetonius references Jesus when he was writing about how Emperor Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome, who, as he said, were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus. And so there are records of the existence of Jesus that were outside of the Scriptures. It wasn't just the Scriptures that tell us that Jesus lived. There is references, historical references, to Jesus living. Another one of the arguments is that even the accounts of the New Testament accounts, the four Gospels, don't claim to be firsthand. In other words, they don't claim to be written by the people who were there. Now, it's true, there are some accounts that do not claim to be firsthand accounts. But Matthew and John, two of the Gospels, were written by two people who knew Jesus. They were eyewitness accounts. They were people who walked through this and wrote down what they saw. Matthew and John, who wrote those books, Matthew and John, were disciples of Jesus. And they wrote about their own experiences with Jesus. Now, one of the Gospels is the Gospel of Mark, which was written by a man named Mark. But Mark was the companion and scribe to one of Jesus' disciples, one of his closest disciples. In fact, the one that he said he was going to build his church around. And that disciple was Peter. And so many historians believe that the book that was called Mark was actually dictated to Mark by Peter. Now there is one, Luke, the book of Luke, that was written by a person who was not an eyewitness. But listen to how he opens his manuscript. Listen to how he begins his account. He says, "Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught." And so the argument that the Gospels weren't first-hand accounts is not really that great of an argument, because two of them were definitely first-hand accounts. One of them was probably dictated by someone who had a first-hand account. And the one who clearly says it wasn't a first-hand account was written by a man who was a doctor, he was a scientist, he was someone who set out from the beginning to put together a meticulously assembled account of Jesus' life and death and resurrection and beyond. So the Gospels were either written by people who had first-hand knowledge, who were eyewitnesses to Jesus' life, or to people who were able to talk directly to people who had seen and witnessed and heard the life of Jesus. The third argument that Jesus never existed is the argument that says that the descriptions of Jesus from all different people seem to be descriptions of 2 to 3 different people and not just one person. There are some who say that Jesus was a Galilean religious leader. There were others who said that he was a prophet. Others who said he was a healer. Others who said he was a revolutionary set out on overturning Rome. And essentially what we have here, and the reason that people say that these are different people, is because it's hard to imagine that all of these things could be all in one person. It's like 2 sides of the same coin, or maybe it's better to say it's like 6 sides of the same dice. There's multiple facets of every one of us. And there were multiple facets of Jesus' character and what Jesus accomplished. And it's just hard for people to imagine that all of these attributes could be in one person. And yet they were in Jesus. There's a professor at Duke University. His name is Eric Myers. He's a professor emeritus in Judaic studies. And this is what he wrote as far as the argument that Jesus never existed. The conclusion that Jesus never existed. He said, "I don't know any mainstream scholar who doubts the historicity of Jesus. The details have been debated for centuries, but no one who is serious doubts that he is a historical figure." So, the second conclusion is simply this, that Jesus did exist, but was just a good teacher. He was a great moral prophet, and that is all. And this is a common belief. In fact, a majority of the U.S. population believes that Jesus was not just a good teacher, but a great teacher. But that's all. And isn't it interesting that even people who doubt the reliability of the Bible or those who reject its legitimacy and authority still have an opinion about Jesus? They still have a belief about Jesus. Now, think about this. So many of the moral standards that the world holds today came from Jesus' teachings. I mean, think about the things that we say commonly today that are actually teachings of Jesus. Judge not, that you not be judged. Turn the other cheek. Love your neighbor. Go the extra mile. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. See, one of the things that you can't deny is that if we all of us lived out the teachings of Jesus, whether you're a Christian or not, if we would just make the decision to live those teachings out, the world would be a better place. In fact, the world is a much better place today because so many people have dedicated their lives to living out Jesus' teachings. But think about this. Jesus' teachings are all based on the existence of a moral authority that is separate from the world and that supersedes the world. In other words, his teachings only make sense if there is an underlying moral authority that is not controlled by the world, it's separate from the world, and that authority supersedes the world, or it has authority over the world. And then Jesus says that he is that moral authority. One day Jesus was talking to a larger group of his disciples, not just the 12, but a larger group of his followers. And he's talking to them and they make this claim that of course they're God's people because they're descendants of Abraham. And Jesus says, hey, listen, I know Abraham. And the people are looking at him like, how can you know Abraham? You're not even 50, bro. Abraham is like hundreds of years ago. How can you say that you know Abraham? And then Jesus uses this phrase that the Jewish people there would have immediately understood when he used it. Because they remember that years before, there was this conversation that Moses had with God. And God is telling Moses that he wants Moses to go to Pharaoh, to go into Egypt, to talk to Pharaoh, to talk to the people, to the Israelites there, and to tell them that God is going to set them free through Moses. And Moses is like, listen, God, when I get there, they're going to ask me, who sent me? Who sent me there to free them? And God says, tell them I am sent you. See, God is saying that my name is I am. I am God. And so when they ask who sent you, say, I am. And so we fast forward to this conversation where the people are asking Jesus, hey, listen, how can you say that you know Abraham when you're not even 50 and Abraham is like hundreds of years ago? Listen to how Jesus answers that question. It says, Jesus answered, I tell you the truth. Before Abraham was even born, I am. Before, not just the few hundred years that it was where Abraham was born, but even before that, before Abraham even existed, Jesus says, I am. Jesus is saying that he is God. He's saying that he is the moral authority that all of his teachings are based on. So the third conclusion then is, if Jesus did exist, and we conclude that Jesus was more than just a good teacher, well, then can we now conclude that Jesus is really God? I'm going to look at 4 things that I believe may support the idea that Jesus is God. The first one is this. When we look at what others said about him. Years before, at least 1,000 years before Jesus lived, there was a song written. They were compiled into a book called Psalms. And in Psalm 22, there is this psalm that's written that predicts Jesus' life and his reign. 1,000 years written before Jesus came on the scene. This is what the psalm says. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. My enemies stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing. That's a pretty accurate description of what happened to Jesus. Surrounded him, they pierced his hands and his feet, and then they divided his clothes and they gambled for it. One of the prophets, a man named Isaiah, and Isaiah was written hundreds of years before Jesus, actually predicts his suffering and the reconciliation with God that came from Jesus' suffering. Listen to what Isaiah writes. He says, but he was crushed, he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of all. So when we read what others wrote about him, what others said about him, they predicted that Jesus was coming, and Jesus fulfilled those predictions. So it just isn't what others said about him, it was also what he said about himself. Jesus, while he is here on earth as a man, accepts the messianic title, the Son of Man, claiming that he is equal with God. This is what Jesus said. He said, or this is the encounter, he said, when the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself? But Jesus remained silent. Then the high priest said to him, I demand in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus replied, you've said it. And in the future you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. Jesus makes the claim that he is God. So it isn't just what others said about him and what he said about himself, but it's also what others saw him do. Jesus one day was talking about how he had the power to forgive. He was forgiving people. And this was the response of the religious leaders. They say, what is he saying? This is blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. And Jesus knew immediately what they were thinking. So he asked them, why do you question this in your hearts? Is it easier to say to the paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven? Or stand up, pick up your mat, and walk? So I will prove to you that the Son of Man has the authority on earth to forgive sins. Then Jesus turned to the paralyzed man and said, stand up, pick up your mat, and go home. And he did. When we look at the things that Jesus did, he did things that only God could do. Jesus was saying in this exchange, what's harder, forgiving somebody's sins or telling a paralyzed man to get up and walk? And the people around would have said, well, of course, it seems like getting somebody to get up and walk is the harder thing to do. And so Jesus says, get up and walk. And the guy gets up, he's paralyzed, gets up and walks. And the thinking was, certainly if this man has the ability to let a paralyzed man get up and walk, then he must have the ability to forgive sins. And if he has the ability to forgive sins, then he must be God. So it wasn't just what others said about him. It wasn't just what he said about himself. It wasn't just what others saw him do, but it's also because of what others did because of Jesus. Long after Jesus' death, we're 2,000 years out of it, Jesus is still followed and worshiped and adored by well over 2.3 billion people around the world. And it was Christians who have been fighting and sought to follow Jesus and to imitate him. And it's those Christians who've done that, who've done some of the most important things in our world today. The very first hospitals were started by Christians because they wanted to care for people's bodies as they cared for people's souls. They wanted to bring healing to the body as they brought healing to the soul. The world's top universities, like Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Oxford, were all started by Christians who wanted to educate people and teach them about Jesus. Even today, the fight to end slavery around the world, the fight to end slavery in the past, especially here in the United States, had its roots in the Christian faith and the Christian faith of those abolitionists who back then and still today seek to end human slavery. Today, Christian organizations all over the world are often the first to respond to war casualties, to natural disasters, to catastrophic accidents. Christians are constantly working to end poverty, food insecurity, sex trafficking, and homelessness. This is the legacy of Jesus that has been honored and followed by Christians all over the world for over 2,000 years. So, is Jesus really God? Well, the people who knew him best, his disciples, the people who spent 3 years with him day and night, watching him, listening to him, observing him, this is the conclusion they came to. Jesus is having a conversation with them, and this is how one of his disciples, Matthew, records it. He says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Right? He wants to kind of get a pulse from the crowd. You know, what are they saying about me? Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist. They'd heard about John the Baptist, this kind of crazy guy who was preaching this crazy message, but everybody wanted to hear him. They thought maybe this was John the Baptist. Some of them had never seen John the Baptist before, right? Some say Elijah. Elijah, one of the great prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures. And they thought maybe this is Elijah returning. Others say Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. That one of the ancient prophets has returned and is here now, and that was Jesus. But then Jesus asked them. He's now talking to the people who knew him best, who had been following him, who had been watching him, who had been listening to him, who had been taking this all in. He said, who do you say I am? And Simon Peter, one of the ones who knew Jesus best, Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah. You are the anointed one. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That was the conclusion that the people knew him best came to. C.S. Lewis, who was an author and professor, had degrees from Oxford and Cambridge, wrote one of my favorite book series of all time, The Chronicles of Narnia, was also a theologian. And in his book, Mere Christianity, he wrote this. He said, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, talking about Jesus. And that's this: I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on the level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. See, C.S. Lewis is saying, listen, you can't just say that Jesus was just a good teacher, because the basis of his teachings include his assertion that he was in fact God. His teachings were based on the idea that he was God. And so either he was crazy because he honestly believed he was God but wasn't, or he was evil, misleading people to believe that he was God, but wasn't. Or we have to conclude that he was, in fact, who he said he was. That he is, in fact, who he said he is. That he is the Messiah, the Word become flesh, the Son of the living God. Listen, for all of us, it really comes down to this. Who is Jesus to us? And really, Jesus is either God or fraud. There's no other option. He can't just be a good teacher. He can't just be a prophet that came. He's either God or he's a fraud. And so the question I want to leave you today, to ponder over after all we've talked about today, is simply this. What do you think the answer is? What do you think the answer is? Was he God or fraud? And then when you take into account all of his teachings and the kind of community that he tried to build, the kind of community that even today followers of Jesus are fighting for, maybe a better question to ask, a better question than what do you think the answer is? The better question that really goes past our simple intellectual reasoning and goes to our heart is, what do you hope the answer is? What do you hope the answer is? Whether it's the answer or not, what is it that you hope the answer is?
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.